They taped the warning to my front door so early that the sky was still that washed-out blue before sunrise and the sprinklers along the loop were ticking in the distance. I saw it when I opened the door to let my dog out, a fluorescent sheet trembling in the cool air, held up with 3 strips of beige tape that matched the stucco like they had actually thought this through. At the top of the page, in thick black letters, were the words that made my stomach drop, a notice that the association intended to record a lien on my home. For about 3 seconds, my brain tried to plug in any explanation except the obvious. A mistake, a mix-up with the old owner, some clerical glitch at the management office. Then my sleepy eyes slid down the page, caught my own lot number, my exact address, and the reason: exterior lighting in violation of restrictions, non-compliance after prior notice, pending lien if not corrected immediately. It was about my patio lights. The warm cafe-style string lights I'd hung on tiny hooks across the inside of my back fence. The ones that made the little slab of concrete out there feel less like a prison yard and more like a tiny courtyard. Those lights. The paper said my fixtures were being treated as commercial signage facing a common area. It listed fines I'd never even seen before. And it referenced something else that made my pulse spike: enforcement under Notice Code 2.3. I had seen that phrase once, buried in the covenants and rules binder, next to a section about second notices and hearings that were supposed to happen before anything as serious as a lien. As I stood there in my doorway, barefoot on the cold tile, I could feel this weird mix of embarrassment and anger climbing up the back of my neck. Someone had walked up to my door in the dark, taped a threat to my house, and walked away like it was nothing. I hadn't even gotten the basic steps they claimed they followed. I didn't know it yet, but that flimsy sheet of fluorescent paper was the first move in what would turn into a full-blown power struggle. They thought they were reminding me who was in charge. In the end, it turned into something closer to an HOA nightmare for them than for me, because I started treating every word they wrote like evidence. That morning, though, I just stared at the page and felt my heartbeat in my ears. I took it down carefully, like I was handling something toxic, and laid it flat on my kitchen counter. In the quiet of my kitchen, with the faint hum of the fridge and the soft glow from the under-cabinet lights, I read every line twice. Intent to record lien. Previous notice. No mention of any hearing. No date for one. No signature from me acknowledging anything. And that's when another detail clicked into place: whoever did this hadn't just overstepped. They had skipped their own rules, the ones they never shut up about in meetings. The ones they used to lecture everyone else. I didn't know exactly how I was going to push back, not yet. But I knew 2 things. First, I was not taking those patio lights down just because someone on the board decided my backyard was a billboard. Second, if they wanted to turn this into a paperwork fight, they had no idea how many receipts I had already saved. To understand how it got that far, you have to see how the place was set up from the beginning. Willow Loop Estates was one of those gated loop neighborhoods that looks peaceful at first glance, all smooth roads curving through beige townhomes and manicured shrubs. The entrance gate clicked shut behind you with a soft, expensive sound, like security and control packaged together. In the afternoons, the air always had this heavy, sweet smell from the fresh mulch baking in the early summer sun. When I bought my unit, the sales brochure talked about low-maintenance living and community standards like they were perks, not warnings. There was a glossy map showing the loop of homes, the pocket park, and the walking path that wound behind the back patios. Somewhere down in the bullet points it mentioned the association, the covenants, and the rules. It sounded normal. Everyone talked about a homeowners association like it was just part of owning in a planned community. At closing, I was handed a fat spiral-bound book labeled Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, plus a stack of policies in plastic sleeves. The woman from the management company slid them across the table like she was giving me a present. I remember flipping through and seeing page after page of rules about paint colors, mailbox designs, what kind of plants were allowed, how long you could leave holiday decorations up. One page had an example of a violation letter, complete with a bold heading and a sample, final notice dated May 12, printed right in the middle like a trophy. I took it home, set it on my counter, and told myself I'd read it on the weekend. I got through maybe 15 pages before my eyes glazed over. Everything was written in that stiff, legal-sounding language that managed to say very simple things in the most complicated way possible. There were clauses about signage, flags, window coverings, and something they called non-standard exterior fixtures. None of it sounded like something I'd ever fight about. That was before I met the board. At my first annual meeting, I walked into the clubhouse and immediately saw her, the treasurer. I'll call her Miss D. She had the kind of expression that looked like she was always at a low-level simmer about something. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, glasses low on her nose, and she had a binder in front of her thicker than the one I got at closing. Next to her was the board president, Tom H. He looked friendlier, more like the kind of neighbor who would talk about lawn care and football. They went through their agenda in a dry, rehearsed tone: budget, reserves, landscaping, rules enforcement. When they reached compliance, Ms. D perked up. She rattled through a list of minor violations from the past quarter, describing them in this clipped, precise way that made it sound like she was announcing criminal charges instead of tall grass and mismatched shutters. Somewhere in the middle of the meeting, they talked about lighting. The president mentioned that security lighting and decorative lighting needed to comply with the guidelines. Ms. D added that anything visible from the common areas had to be uniform in tone, non-commercial in character, and approved if non-standard. The way she stressed certain words stuck with me, but I didn't think much of it. At the time, I didn't own anything more dramatic than a lamp. Back at my unit, my patio was just a bare slab of concrete surrounded by a tan stucco wall and a black metal fence facing the inner loop. In the evenings, the walking path behind the homes would fill with the soft sound of people talking and the faint whoosh of cars passing beyond the gate. My patio, though, felt stark. I had a little table and a couple of chairs, but at night it turned into a shadowy rectangle when the single overhead light clicked off. I wanted it to feel like an actual outdoor room. I work from home, and I liked the idea of sitting outside in the evening, under warm lights, dog curled at my feet, watching the sky fade. So I bought a simple set of warm white string lights, the kind with small round bulbs, and a few command hooks. I planned to hang them just inside the top of my metal fence, looping across in a soft curve. Before I put them up, I actually tried to do the right thing. I pulled out the big rule binder and looked for anything about string lights. The sections on lighting talked about floodlights, bright security fixtures, flashing holiday displays, and neon signs. There was a part about commercial signage not being allowed anywhere visible from the street or common areas. Nothing about low, warm, residential string lights on the inside of a patio. For extra caution, I sent a message through the management portal. I described the lights: small, warm, non-blinking, inside my fence line, on a timer. I asked if I needed to submit a formal architectural request or if it was considered a normal patio decoration. A few days later, the portal showed a response from someone at the office. The answer said that as long as exterior fixtures did not resemble advertising and did not create glare into neighbors' windows, they were generally acceptable. No mention of forms, approvals, or special codes. So I hung the lights. The first night, when the sun slipped down and the bulbs clicked on, my little slab of concrete transformed. The light was soft and golden, not harsh. It barely reached the walking path behind the fence. I sat out there with a drink, listening to the distant hum of tires on asphalt beyond the walls and the rhythmic chirp of crickets in the shrub beds, and felt like I had carved out this tiny pocket of calm. Most of my neighbors didn't seem to care. I caught a passing thumbs up from someone walking their dog one evening, and another neighbor on the loop told me they liked how it made the path feel less gloomy. But there was one person who never looked pleased. She lived a few units down, always in pressed clothes, always with this pinched expression. I'll call her Paula. She walked the loop with a clipboard sometimes, writing things down as she went. When she passed my patio after the lights went up, she would glance in with a sharp little frown, like she was mentally measuring whether my bulbs were 2 lumens too bright. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Lots of people in these places just like things a certain way. But about a month after the lights went up, the first envelope arrived. It was a plain white envelope from the association's management company, with my name and address typed perfectly on the front. I opened it at the kitchen counter, the sound of the paper tearing mixing with the low buzz from the transformer near the back fence outside my window. Inside was a single-page letter titled Courtesy Notice. The letter said that during a recent inspection, they had observed non-conforming exterior lighting visible from common area walkways. It described my small string lights as fixtures installed without prior approval and suggested they had a commercial appearance. It told me I needed to correct the issue by removing or modifying the lights within 10 days to avoid further enforcement. That was the first time I saw a reference to the notice codes, a line near the bottom in small print citing Notice Code 2.1 for the courtesy notice and briefly mentioning that future steps could proceed under Notice Code 2.3 after continued noncompliance. At the time, it just looked like a random internal reference. I had no way of knowing that code would later become the center of everything. I read the letter twice, then went back to the binder. I checked the sections on lighting again. Still nothing specific about string lights. The part about commercial signage talked about banners, flags advertising services, and window decals. I compared the wording back and forth, my eyes moving between the dry paragraphs and the warm bulbs now sitting quiet in the daylight. It didn't add up. I pulled out the email response from the management portal, the one that had said my setup was generally acceptable. It didn't mention any exceptions. I realized then that I had documentation showing they had already green-lighted the concept, even if someone changed their mind later. Instead of ripping the lights down, I made small adjustments. I lowered the hooks so the bulbs sat a little below the top of the fence line. I put them on a stricter timer, so they were only on for a few hours in the early evening. And I sent a new message through the portal, politely pointing out the previous response and asking for clarification. I asked whether there was a separate document or addendum they were relying on. A few days later, there was a short reply in the portal from the office. It said that the association had adopted supplemental architectural guidelines years earlier, and that commercial-style, string lights visible from common areas were generally prohibited unless specifically approved. No attachment. No link. No copy of those guidelines. So I asked for them. I requested a copy of the architectural guidelines and any prior board resolutions related to exterior lighting. I saved a screenshot of my request. Then I waited, my patio quietly glowing each evening and turning off at the new earlier time. Meanwhile, I started noticing Paula more often. At the next open board meeting, I saw her sitting near the front, not in the audience, but off to the side with a thin folder. At some point, the president introduced her as a member of the architectural committee. That explained the clipboard walks on the loop. When they got to their enforcement update, Ms. D reported that the committee was taking a closer look at non-standard exterior fixtures. She didn't name any units, but I could feel eyes flicking around the room. I stayed after the meeting long enough to ask the manager, in a neutral, calm tone, whether those supplemental guidelines were available. She said they were on file and that the office would send them. By the time I walked home along the loop, the air had cooled and a soft, metallic smell drifted up from the wet pavement where the sprinklers had just finished. My lights clicked on as I rounded the corner, a small arc of gold in the tan sameness of the patios. Days went by, and no documents came. Instead, the second envelope arrived. This one wasn't a courtesy notice. The heading was sharper, violation notice, with my lot number and the date lined up in neat rows. It said I had failed to correct the issue. It assigned a fine for noncompliance and warned that continued violation could result in escalating fines, suspension of privileges, and, eventually, legal action that could include a lien against the property. Again, it referenced those internal codes, this time citing that they had proceeded past Notice Code 2.1 and would be relying on further enforcement provisions. The amount on that letter wasn't massive, but it was enough to make a point. And that's what bothered me most. It didn't feel like they were protecting property values. It felt like someone had taken a personal dislike to my tiny patch of warm light and weaponized paperwork to make it disappear. I could have caved. A lot of people would have called it not worth the trouble, taken the lights down, and moved on. That's the trap with these situations. The board counts on you being tired, busy, or conflict avoidant, so they can push as far as they want. There was a line at the bottom of the violation notice, easy to miss, that suddenly made the stakes very, very real. It said that if the issue wasn't resolved by a certain date, the matter would be referred to the board for further enforcement, up to and including recording a lien. And the deadline was only a few weeks away. I circled that date in red pen on my calendar. Every time I walked out back at night, hearing the faint murmur of voices on the path and the distant hum of traffic beyond the wall, I could see the timer ticking down in my head. They had turned my little string lights into a countdown clock. I wasn't ready, yet, to go full scorched earth. I still believed that if I could just show them the inconsistency, someone reasonable on the board would snap out of whatever power trip they were on. So I tried to meet them halfway. I sent another message through the portal, attaching photos of the patio from inside and from the path, showing how low and soft the light really was. I reminded them of their earlier written response, the one that said it was generally acceptable. At the same time, I started keeping better records. I made a folder on my computer and dropped every letter, notice, and screenshot into it. I took photos of the envelopes with their postmarks. I wrote down the dates I saw Paula walking the loop with her clipboard. I wasn't thinking about revenge or a board takeover yet. I just didn't want to feel helpless the next time a beige envelope showed up. The deadline came and went. I still had my lights up, slightly dimmer and lower, with a stricter schedule. I still had no copy of those mysterious supplemental guidelines. And then, early one morning, while the loop was quiet and the air was still, someone walked up to my door, tape in hand, and left a lien warning that pretended a whole step in their own process had never existed. I wasn't ready to fight back in full yet. But as I smoothed that fluorescent paper on my counter, I knew this much: if they wanted to turn a string of warm bulbs into a legal threat, I would turn every word they wrote, every code they cited, and every missing notice into fuel. They had started a timeline. I was going to follow it back to every rule they had skipped. The first thing I did after that lien warning was flip through the rule binder until my fingers hurt. I sat at my dining table with pages fanned out, sticky notes poking from sections about enforcement and hearings, the faint rustle of paper mixing with the low hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Somewhere in all of that dry text, there had to be something about how far the board could actually go. Buried in the middle of the enforcement section, I found it, a paragraph about progressive notices. It described an initial courtesy notice, a formal violation notice, and then, before any lien or legal action, a second notice with a clear invitation to a hearing. That part referenced Notice Code 2.3 by name. It also said owners had to be given a chance to appear, explain, and even bring supporting documents. I leaned back and stared at that line for a long moment. I had the courtesy notice and the violation notice. I did not have any second notice that mentioned a hearing. No hearing date. No form explaining how to request one. Yet the lien warning on my door claimed they had proceeded under Notice Code 2.3 as if that box had been checked. That gap felt like a missing puzzle piece and a smoking gun at the same time. For the first time since this started, I felt something other than dread. I felt a sharp, focused anger. They had skipped their own process, then acted like I was the one ignoring the rules. I took out a notepad and wrote a timeline. Courtesy notice received on one date. Violation notice on another. Portal messages sent. Responses received. I added the early morning lien warning at the end, underlining it twice. Then I drew a blank space where the second notice and hearing should have been. Next to it, in big letters, I wrote, skipped step. If they were willing to gloss over something that basic for me, I wondered how many other owners were being pushed around by threats they didn't know they could question. That question kept echoing in my head as the next board meeting approached. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse felt colder than usual, the air conditioner humming too loudly overhead as if it was trying to fill the awkward silence between neighbors. I took a seat in the second row, my folder of documents balanced on my knees. The fluorescent lights overhead washed everything out in a dull glow. On the table up front, Miss D arranged her papers with surgical precision. The president shuffled his agenda, avoiding eye contact with anyone too directly. They went through their usual items: budget, landscaping, security. A few owners asked about speeding on the loop, about the new shrub bed near the front gate. Then, as always, they reached enforcement. Ms. D leaned into her section. She spoke about compliance like it was a mission statement, listing how many notices had been sent, how some owners were still not correcting violations. Her tone sharpened when she mentioned exterior fixtures. It was the same category my lights fell under, but she never said my lot number out loud. When they opened the floor for owner comments, I stood up. My voice felt tight in my throat at first, but it steadied as I walked to the small microphone. I explained that I had received multiple notices about my patio lights. I mentioned that I had portal responses suggesting they were acceptable, that I had made adjustments, and that I had requested supplemental guidelines that never came. Most importantly, I explained that I had just received a lien warning that claimed they had proceeded under Notice Code 2.3, even though I had never been given any notice of a hearing. I described the missing step without dramatics. I simply laid out the facts in order. There was a moment where the room went very quiet except for the faint buzz of the fluorescent fixtures. The president shifted in his seat. Ms. D adjusted her glasses. The manager said they would need to look into the file. I asked, calmly, to see the documentation showing that the second notice and hearing had been offered. I said I had my timeline and copies of everything I had received. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten anything. But I made sure everyone heard that line about the missing step. Some of the other owners in the room looked from me to the board, their expressions changing from bored to curious. I could feel Paula's eyes on me from the side of the room, her clipboard resting on her lap like a prop in a play. The president responded with that vague, rehearsed reassurance boards always seem to have ready. He said they were confident they followed procedures but would review the record. He said enforcement decisions were not discussed in detail in open session. He said I would hear from management. I sat back down, my heart still pounding, but now it was mixed with a strange calm. The facts were out there, in front of everyone. And once you say something like that out loud, you can't put it back in the box. A few days after the meeting, I got a short email from the management office. It said my file was being reviewed and that they would respond in writing. The message was so brief it felt like it had been written with one eye on a clock. Outside, the afternoon sun baked the sidewalk, and the air shimmered over the blacktop at the end of the loop. Inside, they set the tone by meeting in a smaller room off to the side, the one they used for owner discipline matters. The blinds were drawn, the overhead light a bit too bright. The board sat on one side of the table, with the manager off to the side taking notes. I was on the other side, alone, my folder of evidence between my hands. They asked me to explain my side. So I did. I talked through the timeline, highlighted the missing notice, and calmly pointed to CCR Section 4.3 and their own guidelines. I emphasized that I was not refusing to cooperate, I was asking them to follow their own process and apply their standards fairly. They responded with their own points, mostly repeating how they considered the lights commercial style and visible from the path. But as we went back and forth, I watched their faces when I mentioned that I had reviewed their enforcement logs and board agenda excerpt. When I referenced the words, "Proceed with lien," written next to my lot weeks before any hearing was even mentioned, I saw a flicker of discomfort. I left that hearing knowing two things. First, they might still try to come down on me, because backing off meant admitting they had moved too fast. Second, I had planted something they couldn't easily remove, doubt, not just about my case, but about how they handled others. Chapter 28:00. The decision arrived about a week after the hearing, in yet another official-looking envelope. The sky was a soft gray that afternoon, the smell of rain hanging in the air even though the pavement was still dry. I opened the letter at my kitchen counter, heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. The board's decision was a compromise on paper, but you could see the strain behind it. They had not completely backed down. They reaffirmed that my patio lights were, in their view, a violation of the guidelines. They reduced the fines slightly and temporarily held the lien action instead of dropping it. They said if I did not remove the lights within a new, shorter deadline, they would resume enforcement. In other words, they acknowledged just enough to avoid looking reckless, but not enough to undo what they had already done. They also slipped in a line that told me exactly how they saw me now, as a problem owner who questioned things too much. They suggested, very politely, that future disputes could be avoided if I submitted formal requests before making changes and accepted the committee's decisions without delay. I set the letter down and stared out at my patio, where the empty hooks held the string lights before evening. I could keep fighting over this one thing forever. But as I thought about their partial retreat, their stuck posture, their defensiveness when confronted with their own records, something shifted in my head. This was not just about my lights anymore. I started thinking about every courtesy notice Ms. D had announced in those meetings with that clipped satisfaction. Every time Paula walked the loop with her clipboard, eyes sharp for any deviation. Every neighbor who probably just paid a fine to keep the peace, even if something in their gut told them it was unfair. I remembered the neighbor who had nodded at me on the path, the way some owners had looked at the board during my earlier comment in open session. There was more frustration in this loop than anyone on the board seemed willing to admit. If the same people held power year after year, they could keep turning petty complaints into threats of liens. They could keep skipping steps, hoping no one ever asked to see the logs or the agenda packets. And as long as they did it to each person in isolation, most people would feel too small to push back. That was when the idea began to crystallize. There was another way to deal with this, one that did not depend on convincing the current board to suddenly become reasonable. Instead of fighting them over one string of lights in back rooms and hearings, what if I took all of these receipts into the open and turned their own process into a spotlight? What if the same neighbors they quietly threatened with fines and letters got to see exactly how their leaders handled power, right before an election? The governing documents spelled it out in dry language: owners could nominate themselves for the board. There were rules for elections, for ballot counts, for recalls if necessary. It would take time, patience, and a lot of quiet conversations, but it was there, written in the same covenants they liked to quote at everyone else. That thought was both terrifying and thrilling. The idea of standing for a seat on the board, of challenging the people who treated the rulebook like a weapon, did not come naturally to me. But the alternative was letting them keep escalating their pressure until it hit my bank account in a way I couldn't shrug off. The more I imagined it, the more it felt like this was turning into a full-scale HOA revenge story whether I wanted it or not. The question was whether I would stay the anxious character in the background or turn into the one who finally pushes back. I started small. I pulled out the notice that mentioned the date of the upcoming annual meeting and election. It was easy to overlook, printed in small font near the bottom of a newsletter. I circled it. Then I checked our documents again to confirm the nomination process and deadlines. Next, I organized my folder one more time. I made a condensed version, a 3-page summary showing my case from start to near Lien, with references to Notice Code 2.3, CCR Section 4.3, and that board agenda excerpt. I wrote it in plain language. I did not add drama, the facts were damning enough. Then I reached out to a few neighbors I trusted, the ones whose expressions had said more than their words. I mentioned what had happened. I described how the lien threat came early and how I had to force them to offer a hearing. I explained how vague their guidelines were and how much power they assumed owners would never question. As we talked, I learned I was not the only one who felt hunted by minor rules. One neighbor had been cited for a doormat that was the wrong texture. Another had been told their potted plants were in violation because they were on the wrong side of the porch line. Each story added a layer, turning our quiet loop into something closer to a slow-motion Karen neighbor drama where the villains wore name tags and carried binders. By the time I walked back home on those evenings, the air cooling and the streetlights casting pale circles on the asphalt, the idea of running for the board no longer felt impossible. It felt necessary. I had the notices. I had the codes. I had proof that their enforcement was not as clean and orderly as they wanted everyone to believe. And soon, I knew, I would have an audience. The first real step in my quiet retaliation was filling out the nomination form. It was a single sheet, almost laughably plain, with a line for my name, lot number, and a brief statement of interest. I filled it out at my dining table with my folder of evidence sitting nearby, the cool whir of the ceiling fan above and the distant swish of a car passing the gate drifting through the open window. I did not write anything dramatic in the statement. I said I wanted consistent enforcement, transparent communication, and a focus on actual safety instead of cosmetic control. The first thing I saw was that the supplemental guidelines they had mentioned looked like they had been photocopied to death. In the section on lighting, there was a vague sentence about commercial or cafe-style string lights that create the appearance of an entertainment venue, saying they required prior approval. No examples. No photos. No clear definition. It was more opinion than rule. Next, I flipped through the enforcement log. The entries for my unit showed the courtesy notice, the violation notice, and then a line that said, referred to board for further enforcement under Notice Code 2.3. There was no line item for a second notice. Nothing about a hearing date offered or scheduled. Just a jump. In another folder, I found a copy of the covenants section labeled CCR Section 4.3, which included what they called the mailbox rule. It said any required notice had to be mailed to the owner's address on record and that it was effective a certain number of days after mailing. It also listed specific types of notices where this applied, including enforcement notices that preceded legal action or liens. I thought back to my mailbox and the envelopes I had kept. I had the courtesy notice. I had the violation notice. I had the lien warning taped to my door. What I did not have was any mailed second notice invoking CCR Section 4.3 before threatening a lien. Right as that realization settled in, I turned to one more set of records, board meeting packets. In one, there was an agenda for a recent closed session. Under the enforcement portion, in a list of bullet points, I saw an entry that made my jaw clench. It was a simple line that read, Lot 27, patio lighting issue, proceed with lien if no correction by deadline date. No note about offering a hearing. No note about whether they had sent the second notice. They had talked about recording a lien in their closed meeting before completing their own steps on paper. That agenda page became another prop in my growing folder, a kind of board agenda excerpt that quietly admitted how they really operated. At this point, the whole situation stopped feeling like a minor dispute over decor and started feeling like a financial trap being slowly tightened. Each letter mentioned fines accruing. The lien warning hinted at costs, attorney fees, and management charges that could be piled on and attached to my property if they pushed forward. If they followed through, it would not just be about some warm bulbs on a fence, it would be about thousands of dollars, my equity, and the possibility that this place I had worked so hard to buy could be leveraged against me. I went home from the records inspection with a folder stuffed with copies. The late afternoon light slanted through my blinds, striping the walls, and my patio lights clicked on in the background as if on cue. I spread everything out on my table in rows, violation letters, portal printouts, the CCR Section 4.3 mailbox rule, the supplemental guidelines, and that board agenda excerpt about my lot. Looking at it all, I realized the board had made a mistake bigger than any string of lights. They had turned their personal preferences into enforcement without backing it up with the required process. They had skipped the very step that was supposed to protect owners from arbitrary punishment. I started marking everything with sticky notes. One color for their claims, another for what the documents actually said. I highlighted the gap where Notice Code 2.3 required a second notice and a hearing. I circled the line in CCR Section 4.3 about mailing. With each mark, my frustration hardened into something more strategic. I still wasn't thinking about getting anyone removed. Not yet. But I was absolutely done being the quiet owner who shrugged and paid. The next letter I sent was different from the polite portal messages I had started with. It was still calm, still factual, but you could feel the shift. I wrote to the management office and the board at the same time. I laid out the timeline of notices I had received, referenced the exact dates, and noted the absence of any mailed second notice as required before enforcement under Notice Code 2.3 and CCR Section 4.3. I described, in simple terms, how I had never been offered a hearing. I referenced their own architectural guidelines and pointed out how vague they were about cafe-style lighting. I attached photos again, emphasizing that my setup was low, warm, and not visible as any kind of signage from the street. I mentioned the earlier portal response that called it generally acceptable. Most importantly, I ended the letter by asking them to do two things: suspend any lien action and schedule a proper hearing where I could present my evidence. I made it clear I would attend and bring all of the records I had reviewed. Dropping that letter off, I felt the late afternoon heat pressing off the sidewalk in waves, the air smelling faintly of heated concrete and fertilizer from the common lawns. The quiet of the loop felt heavier, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Days passed. I still walked my dog in the evenings, my patio lights flicking on behind me as I locked my back door. I noticed more eyes cutting toward my fence when people used the walking path. Some were curious, some annoyed, and some sympathetic. One neighbor started nodding when we passed each other, that kind of nod that says they know something is going on even if no one is saying it out loud. When the board finally responded, they did it with a letter that tried to sound firm but cautious. It said they believed they had acted appropriately but, as a gesture of goodwill, they would offer a hearing at the next possible time. There was a date and time listed. It was a weekday evening, soon enough that it felt like they wanted it over with but far enough away for them to prepare. They had finally acknowledged the step they skipped, but only after I pointed it out in writing and cited their own codes back at them. By this point, my small patio lights had turned into a full-blown case study in how an association could twist vague rules to fit personal taste, then rush ahead without following its own enforcement steps. I had the violation letters, the missing notice code 2.3 step, the CCR section 4.3 mailbox rule, and even a board agenda excerpt spelling out their lien plans before any hearing, all laid out like a quiet indictment of their process. With the hearing looming, it stopped being only about whether my lights stayed up and started feeling like a test of whether owners in our loop had any leverage at all when the board decided to push. As the hearing date approached, I noticed more little signs of tension. Paula walked the loop more often, clipboard in hand, her eyes flicking to my patio like it was a crime scene. Ms. D started parking closer to the clubhouse on meeting nights, arriving with a rolling briefcase instead of just a binder. In my unit, I refined my folder. I slipped each document into a clear sleeve, added a cover page with bullet points, and even printed a simple chart that showed the required enforcement steps versus the ones they had actually taken in my case. The air in my kitchen was cool, my fridge humming quietly as I lined everything up in order. The night of the hearing, I could feel the temperature drop outside as the sun went down, a cooler breeze threading through the loop and rustling the hedges along the path. I walked to the clubhouse with my folder under my arm, the faint glow of my patio lights visible behind me like a small, stubborn beacon. When I dropped that form at the management office, the receptionist gave me a quick, surprised look. It was clear they didn't get many candidates outside the usual circle. The rules said any qualified owner could run. No one had ever told us we needed an invitation. The board had simply gotten used to re-electing themselves, year after year, while most people stayed home. I knew if I wanted to stand a chance, I couldn't rely on a name on a ballot. I needed other owners to know what was at stake. So I did something almost as tedious as reading the covenants, I walked the loop. In the late afternoons, when the sun dipped low and the air cooled just enough that you could stand outside, I knocked on doors. Sometimes I was met with polite disinterest. Other times, people stepped onto their porches, arms folded, stories spilling out. I never started with my lights. I started with a question, whether they felt enforcement had been fair. Over and over, I heard the same kind of phrases. They felt singled out for small things. They didn't know they could ask for records. They thought if they argued, things would get worse. I listened, and then I told them about my lien warning over low string lights, about notice code 2.3, about CCR section 4.3 and the missing second notice that had almost turned into a real financial threat. When I showed them copies of the enforcement log entries and that board agenda excerpt where my lot was listed next to proceed with lien, you could see the shock settle in. It wasn't gossip. It was ink on paper, their leaders using closed meetings to advance punishment while skipping the steps they bragged about in their newsletters. I didn't promise anyone miracles. I just said that if they were tired of living in a place where decor decisions could turn into lien threats, they needed to show up to the annual meeting, turn in their ballots, and consider giving someone new a seat at the table. The more conversations I had, the more I realized how shallow the current board's support really was. People didn't love them. They tolerated them. They assumed the association had to be this way, cold and petty, to function. No one had ever shown them what the rules actually said. Somewhere in the middle of all that walking and talking, I realized my little folder of receipts wasn't just a campaign prop. If the board kept pushing the lien angle after I had documented their skipped steps and requested records, they weren't just being annoying, they were flirting with real legal scrutiny. Owners here had the right to complain to oversight bodies or even seek their own counsel. And while I had zero interest in turning my life into a courtroom exercise, I knew that if they kept ignoring CCR Section 4.3 and Notice Code 2.3 after being put on notice, they weren't just abusing power socially, they were handing any future challenger a roadmap for a formal complaint. Word got around, slowly but steadily. A couple of neighbors asked if I had something written down they could share. So I made one more document, just 2 pages long, printed front and back. It didn't attack anyone personally. It listed facts, how the enforcement sequence was supposed to work, what had actually happened in my case, and how owners could request records themselves. I mentioned the sample, final notice dated May 12 from the welcome packet, showing how even their own example included multiple steps and an invitation to be heard. By the time the meeting notice arrived with the ballot attached, more owners were paying attention than the board realized. At the mailbox cluster, people lingered a little longer, envelopes in hand, trading quick comments about the upcoming election. Some asked me flat out if I really thought things could change. I said change would be slow and messy, but if the same people kept the same seats, nothing would change at all. I filled out my own ballot at the kitchen counter with the patio door open, the soft evening air drifting in. I voted for myself, of course, but I also circled one other candidate I had spoken with who seemed reasonable, someone who had complained quietly for years and never thought of running until now. The ballot instructions mentioned how many spaces you could mark, how to return the envelope, how proxies worked. The same rulebook that had been used against us had quietly left a door open. The night of the annual meeting felt different almost from the moment I stepped outside. The clubhouse parking lot was more crowded, cars lining the loop, engines ticking as they cooled in the soft dusk. The air carried the mixed smell of cut grass and exhaust, with a hint of someone's dinner drifting from an open kitchen window. Inside, the chairs were fuller than I had ever seen them. Instead of a handful of bored faces, the room buzzed with low conversation. Owners clutched ballots and envelopes. Some had copies of my summary pages tucked into folders. The president looked out over the crowd with a tight expression, like he had expected a quiet formality and gotten something closer to a town hall. On the table at the front sat the familiar cast, the president, Miss D with her ever-present binder, another director, the manager, and a stack of ballot envelopes in a clear plastic container. Paula hovered near the side, clutching her clipboard, like she had wandered into a show she thought she would be directing and realized she was part of the scenery instead. The meeting followed procedure at first. They covered the budget, mentioned reserves, said a few upbeat phrases about improvements. When they reached the election item, the manager explained the process, ballots counted by volunteers, candidates announced, then questions. It all sounded so orderly, so clean, you would never have guessed how messy the enforcement logs looked behind the scenes. When it was time for candidate introductions, I stood when they called my name. My heart thudded in my chest, but the room didn't tilt or blur. I had rehearsed what I would say, sitting at home with my folder open and the quiet hum of my fridge in the background. I did not make it about my lights. I spoke about process. I said owners deserved consistent enforcement, not selective punishment. I said hearings should be offered before lien threats, not after owners demanded them. I mentioned, without naming names, that documentation I had reviewed showed skipped steps and decisions about liens discussed in closed sessions before required notices were mailed. You could feel the air in the room change. People shifted forward in their chairs. Some looked toward the board table, eyebrows raised. The president tried to keep his expression neutral. Ms. D's fingers tightened on the edge of her binder. I ended by saying that I believed our association could be firm without being punitive, structured without being hostile. That the rules should feel like guardrails, not weapons. And that the only way to get there was to put new people at the table who were willing to question how it's always been done. The other candidates introduced themselves. Some repeated the usual lines about property values and order. One of the newer faces talked about wanting a friendlier community. As they spoke, I scanned the room and saw more nodding than I used to see in any meeting. People were tired, but they were also ready for something different. Then the ballots were collected. Volunteers sat at a side table and began counting, the rustle of paper mixing with the faint ticking of the wall clock and the low hum of the air conditioner. While we waited, the president opened the floor to questions. Owners didn't waste the opportunity. They asked about enforcement transparency, about why some violations seemed to get immediate aggressive follow-ups while others lingered. One asked if they could see examples of notices and how they were supposed to progress before any lien. A few used phrases I recognized from my summary, mentioning Notice Code 2.3 and the Mailbox Rules section in CCR Section 4.3. The board answered, but their responses sounded thinner than usual. The crowd had more information now. They weren't satisfied with vague assurances. As the ballot count dragged on, I realized there was more hanging in the air than simple who-sits-where politics. If the same group retained control after being confronted with their own enforcement shortcuts, it wouldn't just be frustrating, it would signal to everyone that documented inconsistencies, skipped notices, and near-lien threats could continue with no internal check. At that point, owners' only options would be external, formal complaints, legal review, outside agencies. The board wasn't just facing a popularity contest, they were staring at a choice between changing course from within or inviting the kind of scrutiny they had always seemed sure they were untouchable enough to avoid. When the vote tally was finally ready, the manager walked back to the front with a single sheet in hand. You could hear the soft scrape of chairs as people shifted, the rustle of clothing, even someone's keys clinking in their pocket. The room felt smaller, the fluorescent lights sharper. The results came in pieces. The first director's seat went to the familiar incumbent, someone who had never been the loudest or most controlling. The second seat, the one with the tightest race, went to the new candidate I had spoken with, the quiet neighbor who wanted more balance. And the third seat, the one Ms. D had occupied for years, went to me. She lost by a narrow margin, only a handful of votes. But in the end, that was enough. The treasurer who had turned my warm string lights into a pretext for a lien threat, who had cherished her binder more than any neighbor's trust, was out. The reaction in the room was subtle but undeniable. A few people exhaled audibly. Someone in the back gave a small clap before catching themselves. Paula's shoulders went up and then down in a stiff motion, as if bracing against a gust of wind that never arrived. The president tried to smooth it over, thanking the departing director for her service, welcoming the new board members. But the balance of power had shifted. It wasn't a revolution. It was a recalibration. The very people they assumed would never challenge them had quietly used ballots, not shouting, to rearrange the seating chart. Serving on the board was not glamorous. It was long agendas, late-night emails, and the realization that behind every violation letter was a person who might have had 10 other things go wrong that week. But from my first official meeting in that new chair, with my name tentatively written on a folded piece of paper in front of me, I knew why I had gone through all of it. One of the first items I requested for the agenda was an enforcement review. We didn't rush into public finger-pointing. Instead, we started by looking at our own processes with the same scrutiny owners had been subjected to for years. We laid out the covenants, the sample, final notice dated May 12 sheet, the CCR Section 4.3 mailbox rule, and the written procedures for Notice Code 2.3. We compared them to how notices had actually been sent. The gaps were obvious. The remaining directors, including the president, could see it too. No one wanted to say that out loud at first, but silence doesn't change ink on a page. Once we agreed that our enforcement policy was inconsistent, the next question was what we would do about it. We drafted a revised enforcement policy, one that made the sequence crystal clear in plain language. Courtesy notice. Formal violation notice. Required second notice with a hearing offer before any lien threat. All mailed in compliance with CCR Section 4.3. No more skipping steps because someone on the committee was impatient. No more lien warnings taped to doors before hearings were even mentioned. We also revisited the architectural guidelines, especially the section on lighting. We replaced the vague, commercial-style language with specifics, brightness limits, color temperature, hours of operation, mounting height. We included examples of acceptable residential string lights and what genuinely counted as advertising or signage. Owners could read it and understand without needing a translation. Then, finally, we looked at my case. I recused myself from the vote, but I stayed in the room while they discussed it. With the new policy drafted and the old one exposed, it was hard for anyone to argue that things had been handled flawlessly. In the end, the board voted to rescind the fines in my file, withdraw the lien authorization, and mark the matter as closed. The decision letter I received this time was short and almost humble. It acknowledged process concerns and thanked me for my patience. It confirmed that my patio lights, adjusted to comply with the updated guidelines, were permitted. The evening I read that letter, I stepped out onto my patio at dusk and watched the bulbs blink on, warm and soft against the deepening blue. The walking path behind the fence was quiet except for the soft crunch of someone's footsteps and the distant hum of a car outside the gate. The lights didn't feel like a provocation anymore. They felt like a small, steady boundary line. This is my home, and I get some say in how it feels. The cost of getting there hadn't been trivial. There were months of stress, letters piling up on my counter, and that constant knot in my stomach every time I saw a beige envelope in my mailbox. I had spent evenings at the clubhouse instead of relaxing at home, pored over dense documents instead of watching something mindless. I had probably made myself unpopular with a few people who preferred owners to stay quiet. But there was a different payoff too. The next time someone got a courtesy notice, they also got a clear explanation of their rights. Hearings were scheduled before, not after, threats were made. The architectural committee had to put explanations in writing instead of relying on unwritten preferences. The association still enforced rules, but it no longer felt like a petty game of gotcha. Neighbors started stopping me on the loop not to complain, but to say things felt different. Fewer surprise letters. More warnings that felt like reminders instead of ultimatums. Some people still didn't love having any association at all, but they at least felt like they weren't living under a constant shadow of punishment.